Hello, my friends. David Parsons here. Welcome to Nostalgia Trap. Hope you are doing well. If you've listened to our show at all over the years, you know we talk a lot about the concept of like living underground or underground movements, politically, socially, culturally, otherwise. What is it to live underground? What does it mean to have like a punk scene or an indie scene? What does it mean to have an underground political movement? What is an underground newspaper? Well, we've thought a lot about that and we've talked a lot about it, but my guest today, it just kind of blew my mind with the insights and history she brings to this concept. Her name is Lara Cohen. She has a new book out right now from Duke University Press. It is called Going Underground: Race, Space, and the Subterranean in the 19th-Century United States. And again, you know, she talks about the origins of that whole concept of underground is from the Underground Railroad, which I had no idea. And we just go from there. But I wanted to read the introduction to her book, not the whole introduction, but just the first paragraph, because I think it lays out a little of where she's headed with this. And I think it's just such a great, I love metaphors like this. I love the real underground versus the metaphorical underground and how she plays with it in this book. But here is the introduction to Lara Cohen. This is from the introduction to Lara Cohen's Going Underground. At the end of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, the unnamed narrator, running from three drunken white men, falls into an open coal chute. After whirling on in the blackness for a time that might have been days, weeks, he famously decides to take up residence underground. Making his home below a building rented strictly to whites in a section of the basement that was shut off and forgotten during the 19th century, he adopts a way of life that is also figuratively underground. He fights a battle against the resonantly named monopolated light and power by stealing electricity and learns to speak in a subterranean register he calls the lower frequencies. Going underground takes his descent as a provocation to ask what other undergrounds were shut off and forgotten during the 19th century and what possibilities they may yet hold. Practices of collective subversion, resistance, refusal, and insurrection have existed as long as practices of domination. But the idea of underground as a site of clandestine, unruly activity is an invention of the 19th century. First popularized as a metaphor by newspaper coverage of the Underground Railroad in the 1840s, the underground gave people new language and imagery to envision possibilities for living otherwise. In order to discern these visions, Going Underground excavates a vibrant world of 19th century subterranean literature, including black radical manifestos, anarchist periodicals, exposés of the urban underworld, manuals for sex magic, and the initiation rites of secret societies. I also seek out the underground obsessions of more familiar literature from the period, one whose emblematic text, Moby Dick, after all, begins with the voice of the sub-librarian, a painstaking burrower and grubworm. This study of early undergrounds is not simply antiquarian, it also has designs on the present. By mining past ideas of the underground, what forgotten modes of political imagination might we reanimate for today? So I just think this is a fantastic book and a fantastic set of ideas. I hope you enjoy this conversation. We've got lots more of this type of stuff on the Nostalgia Trap Patreon page. We've got that linked in the episode description. Really appreciate our supporters. We get told all the time by the people who listen to the show that we're having conversations here they can't find anywhere else. And if you believe in that project and support that project, then why not subscribe? Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, and our subscribers get access to our entire bonus library that at this point goes back many years, tons of great interviews, video series, great stuff on there. We appreciate everyone who throws us a little bit of cash every month, and if you can do that, Patreon is where you do it. Thanks so much. Enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Lara Cohen. Lara Cohen, thank you so much for joining me. I'm very excited to talk with you about your newest book, which is called, let me just say it right at the start. It's called Going Underground: Race, Space, and the Subterranean in the 19th Century United States. Thank you for joining me. Good to see you.
Thanks so much for having me.
This book is a book that I think a lot of people who listen to Nostalgia Trap and others might be interested in because it connects a lot of ideas that are floating around in terms of this notion of underground, which is something that I realized I use that term all the time in my work, thinking about the Vietnam War and like underground radical anti-war activists. There's this documentary I've seen a million times and shown in class about the Weather Underground, which are this radical group with Bernardine Dorn, a figure who was instrumental in that group, saying at the beginning of the documentary, she says, "I spent 11 years underground." And I'm always thinking, what exactly does she mean by that? And reading your book, Going Underground, which is mainly about the origin of this term and these ideas in the 19th century, it just blew my mind because it's a different conception of where these things come from. I'd never really thought about where the term underground comes from, but it seems like maybe we can just start here. Your book is locating it in around the idea of like the abolitionist movement and the 1840s and 1850s and the Underground Railroad and that sort of thing. I had no idea that that's where the origin of that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I can't swear to that, but that is definitely the first place that I started seeing the kind of like widespread circulation of the term is in these kinds of newspaper accounts of the Underground Railroad. And my sense is that like that's kind of where the term kind of like gained traction. But it still took a pretty long time, I would say, for its definition to kind of crystallize. And so it's really that kind of period from when it starts like kind of showing up to when that meaning starts to kind of consolidate that I'm most interested in.
Yeah, the underground as a both a physical space and a kind of theoretical idea. That's what that kind of grabbed me because I'm thinking about even in the actual Vietnam War in Vietnam, a major part of both the mythology and the actual practical operation of the war was in these tunnels. That became a part of the mythology and romance of the Viet Cong, which was something that was brought up by American anti-war activists who kind of wanted to also be underground in maybe like a figurative way. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it seems like a big part of what you're jumping off of is an idea that I think maybe came from like being a kid and hearing stories about Harriet Tubman and hearing about the Underground Railroad. I imagined an actual railroad under the ground, like a subway. I mean, you actually mentioned that thought in your introduction. That's actually a pretty common idea. But can you talk a little bit about that, like that difference between a real underground space and a metaphorical underground space? Because it seems like it's key to your whole idea here.
Yeah, I mean, that's an idea that kind of, so-called misconception about the Underground Railroad that like Colson Whitehead talks about when, in like the interviews for his book, Underground Railroad. And that was, that's the kind of conceit of that book, right? Is that it's like real. But what turns out to be really interesting about that is that like that's not just our misconception. That's really how people talked about the Underground Railroad in the like mid-19th century. So like in the kind of newspaper coverage of it, and also just in the kind of broader like kind of print culture around it, because there were like poems about it, songs about it, novels about it. People often imagined it like as you said, an actual subway. But like what's wild about that is that there were no actual subways at the time.
Right.
So like it's all very well and good for us, right, to like kind of like project it back into the past and think like, okay, so it was like a railway underground. But like that's not something that people were even like like really imagining at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So it takes on this like fantastical quality that I think we almost lose, even as it does seem fantastical to us to think of a railway underground. But it's like even more fantastical because there's no like material reference for it at the time.
Right, right.
So
It's like we're inventing the subway in order to kind of wrap our minds around some other social or political or cultural phenomenon. Yeah.
yeah, totally.
Oh God, that's such a wild idea. The underground as kind of like this romantic imagined space seems like a common trope here too. The kind of like that it's like a fantasy. Like, does it really exist? And yet at the same time, we seem to talk very, I don't know, very casually about the idea that ideas from the underground bubble up to the surface all the time, and there's like seems to be this relationship. And I thought that was one of the smartest things that about your book is kind of understanding and maybe intervening in that idea of that relationship, because it's very common, I think, that people think, and maybe that's something out of 20th century culture too, is like punk subculture, comes up from the underground. But you kind of differentiate between what is a subculture and what is the underground, and I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that, the difference between those things.
Yeah, I mean, so that isn't really how the book was supposed to go originally, because I did think initially that I would write a book about 19th century subcultures. And like, you know, I wrote a fanzine for many years as a teenager. Like I was definitely invested in certain ideas about subculture. And and then my first book was on like 19th century print culture. So I was like, oh, okay, so what are basically like, what's the kind of 19th century version of a fanzine, or what do print subcultures look like at that time? But then when I started doing this research, um, they just turned out to like not match up. And so like one of the first places that I started, or one of the first kinds of bodies of literature that I started reading for this, were these city mysteries, which were these like very sensationalist, kind of lurid account novels. Often they were serialized, that were supposed to like reveal the kind of dark underbelly of, of a city. And many cities had them, and it was kind of a way of putting like your city on the map. And I was like, okay, I'm
the
gonna look at these.
Subterranean, yeah.
Right.
Right,
And so
yeah.
they're also very invested in the kind of like language of the underground. They're also that's where you see this kind of motif of what they call the upper 10 and the lower million. So it's a kind of like a class hierarchy as well. So I was like, okay, I'm going to look there because they're full of all kinds of like things that I would describe as like subcultures. So they've got like conspirators and like bands of, robbers, and just like various types of like enthusiasts of one kind or another. And they were themselves like, they're mass produced, but they're also like some of them are kind of like edgier than others. Some of them are like verging on pornography. So they have their own kind of like, I think some of them are kind of like, kind of sub rows of themselves in terms of their kind of print circulation.
Right.
So I started reading a ton of these. And the weirdest thing that I found was that like all of these, kind of figurative underground groups are always like located physically underground. And the chapter I write about them just lists like all of these kinds of examples of them. And it's just kind of hilarious. Like it's just so consistent. And so they're in tunnels, they're in sewers, they're in basements, they're in like sub basements, they're in like secret, all kinds of like secret spaces, but like consistently actually underground. And so that was the point at which I was like, that I started to realize that this figurative sense of the underground really had not like took a very long time to get to separate from this literal sense of the underground.
Yeah. What era are these city mysteries? When are these being popularized?
So it's the 1840s to 1850s that they're kind of at their peak.
Wow, I would have anticipated them being later. I always think of like, the period of all this anxiety about cities happening, in the late 19th century after the Civil War. But it just makes me think about as you're talking about these like subterranean spaces of these mysteries and these stories. They're sort of like it reminds me of the like noir literature and crime literature. Of the and kind of pulp fiction of the 1930s and 1940s. The stuff that gave birth to like film noir is all about crime and the world of crime being an underground. And so much of those stories are city stories, or urban stories, places where you find like the stuff underneath.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I do think, that there is like probably a genealogy that like stretches from those novels to like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, the later noir novels and then the movies as well. Um, but I think the thing that I was kind of most compelled by were all of the ways that, like all the ways I kind of failed to recognize anything that I knew in these texts. And going back to your question about kind of subcultures, the ways that these undergrounds that I was seeing kind of like failed to match up to my idea of subculture. And so one of the most kind of consistent or salient aspects of that is the fact that they retain this kind of literal meaning of the underground.
Mm.
But there are other kind of ways they depart from subculture that I'm happy to talk about as well.
Yeah, that idea of the literal underground and how it relates is something that makes a lot of sense to me, and at the same time I'm kind of like it makes me think a lot about hearing that term as a teenager on MTV and really trying to conceive of a space of where this underground is. And it's thinking about it as coming out of abolition and that era. You're talking about a racialized space, and it seems like,
Yes.
I mean, it's in the subtitle of your book, that race and space, right? There's something going on here in the way we think of like otherness or foreign spaces, or something that's different from what is acceptable in the quote unquote above ground spaces. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because it seems like that makes sense to me too, when we're thinking about the underground as like a place where people who are not welcome in other spaces are going to find themselves.
Yeah. So like from its kind of earliest uses, I think these kinds of the images of the underground are linked to racialized Blackness, and the kind of key site of that for the book is Mammoth Cave, which is in Kentucky, which opened to the public as a tourist attraction at the beginning of the 1840s, and was famous in part because all of the cave guides were enslaved men. Mm. And so in that chapter, I look at the literature around Mammoth Cave, and one of the things I'm most interested in there is how that literature, which is all by white authors, associates and like conflates even the caves with the guides, and associates, the darkness of the cave with like the darkness of the guide's skin.
Wow.
So on the one hand, we have that, but on the other hand, I'm really like maybe even more interested in that chapter in how the guides are kind of conceiving their work in the cave. And so even as I'm kind of tracing this like phobic and racist association of the cave and the guides, I'm trying to kind of like think about that as a response to this kind of theorization of the cave and maybe even of the underground itself that's actually coming from the guides' own performances in the caves. Because
what are those performances? I wonder how they're presenting this cave, because cave tours are something that I think became pretty common in America. But your book points out that this is in the 19th century. There's sort of like this not only a fascination with the figurative underground, but like the literal, like excavation, mining, volcano metaphor. There's a lot going
Yeah.
on in terms of actually going into the earth, and I wonder how they're presenting these cave
Yeah, so
stories. Yeah.
it's kind of all the above. Like they do kind of like draw the visitors' attentions to like particular kind of geological formations and the human history inside the cave, and they're pointing out like indigenous artifacts in the cave and so on. But they're also doing stuff that's like incredibly like theatrical. So one of the most famous of the cave guides, Stephen Bishop, had this trick where he would like um, as he was about to lead the visitors into this one particular room, like a cavern of the cave, he would have them extinguish their lamps because they had to carry lamps all through the cave. Obviously, there was no lighting inside. And then he would have them extinguish them, and then all of a sudden he would instruct them to look up, and the walls were and the ceiling of the cavern were covered with like gypsum crystals, so they sparkled because he would keep his own lamp lit. So he was like putting on, a light show for them, basically.
Right.
And he would tell stories and he would sing. And so it's like both a kind of scientific enterprise and also very much like a very much like a kind of aestheticized one as well.
God, the ones that I went to when I was young were like had big fake spider webs in them and were much more like, I don't know, they were science fiction or Halloween themed, that kind of like they capitalize on the spooky element of it though. But I mean, as you go, if you're in the West, I mean, there are a lot of caves that also, are doing histories of the indigenous cultures that were living around these caves and painting inside them, etc. And that's a part of it too. Which seems like it intersects with what you're talking about here too, is like the kind of indigenous underground. And I thought that was a really compelling part of your book as well, was sort of how these things are related in terms of how we think about race in America, of indigenous cultures, enslaved people, and this underground being a kind of key metaphor for understanding how those things go together. I thought that was really great.
Yeah. And I talk a little bit about the kind of indigenous underground of the 19th century in the book, but it is definitely much more focused on Blackness and the underground. And I'm interested like in kind of the various paths that racialization of the underground takes. Most of the book is really focused on Black authors' kind of elaboration of the underground and what they do with this racialization of the underground. But then I also trace, and I think you were kind of pointing to this earlier, a kind of strand in which part of what makes the underground kind of compelling, and this is where it gets, I think, very kind of politically messy, even radical for a lot of white authors, is its kind of unknowability. And I argue that that's never not racialized too. So it's like a very, the kind of the politics of it are very ambiguous and messy.
That's a really incredible idea. Yeah, like the unknowability built into the underground is also, I mean, it seems like it's building in an unknowability about race too. It's like kind of, is that what you're saying, is kind of like the structure, the way we think about the underground is sort of structuring race too?
Yeah, and I think it's even kind of worse. Like I think that unknowability is like a white perception of Black unknowability, of like a perception of racial difference in which
right
like a racialized other is just kind of like is unknowable.
How if I mean, I think we've talked a lot about kind of the way that people outside the underground think about the underground, right? And the kind of like as this unknowable fantasy space that exists in somewhere I could never access. But what about these Black authors you're talking about in your book that are kind of writing from a different perspective, where they're like either in the underground or conceiving of it? How do they think of the underground? Because it can't be as an oppositional space always. It seems like there are people who exist there too.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I should be clear that not all of the Black authors that I write about are themselves kind of involved in undergrounds, but some of them are.
Mm-hmm.
Or some of them, I think, are trying to kind of summon undergrounds that they kind of wish they could join, or that they don't, that kind of don't exist yet.
Well, you start with Ralph Ellison and Invisible Man, which I forgot. Sort of, there's a sequence at the end where the character is going literally physically underground. It seems like it's a perfect sort of summation of the two elements of your argument in some ways. It's a perfect place to start.
Yeah, and the reason I begin with that is like when he does kind of discover his the basement that he lives in for a time, he says that it had been closed off since the 19th century. And that was just like such a striking phrase to me, because I was like, it's this image of an underground that, you know, was somehow open in the 19th century, right? But then like rendered inaccessible, that he is like reopening.
So when it's open, when the underground is open, what is it? How are we thinking of it, especially in people that are sort of thinking of as a kind of positive place, or a place to build, a place to grow, a place to be?
Yeah, it's kind of all those things. And this is maybe its like distinguishing feature, is that it's so multiple. And so, you know, for some of the writers I talk about, it's like a space in which one could kind of like gather collectively and kind of conspire. For some people, it's kind of a place of respite, to like where one could go and just kind of like rest, or you know, build up energy. Yeah.
No, I was
sorry. Were you about to say something?
No, I was just affirming. I'm thinking of it's kind of a place to get away in some way, right? It seems like, and I'm like, what are they getting away from?
Yeah, and to me that was really important, because I was really I it helped me understand that the underground didn't have to be a space of resistance, even though I think in a kind of like everyday usage of it, we often think of it that way. But for so many of these writers, it really didn't fit into that kind of like binarized model of like, you've got the above ground, and then you've got the underground that kind of responds to it in this kind of oppositional way, but that it has like a certain kind of sometimes autonomy from the above ground. It's like not determined by it. And it's not always reacting to it. Like sometimes it is, but not always. And so like some of the writers I talk about, in particular, this songwriter and anti-slavery activist, Joshua McCarter Simpson. He writes these songs that he describes as being kind of for the Underground Railroad. Although one of the questions I ask in the book is, you know, what that means to be for the Underground Railroad. But he often, in his depictions of the Underground Railroad, where it is, as we were saying earlier, like an actual space you could go into, an actual train, it often seems like it occupies a kind of different time. And that's something that comes up a lot, that the underground could be, could kind of hold a different temporality.
Yeah.
So there are all these ways in which it's kind of like not just underneath, but at some like almost undiscoverable angle to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And then that really like is
I love that idea. I'm with you completely. I mean, I love the idea. Yeah, a different experience of time. I mean, there's something. It keys into so many like 60s and 70s, you know, sort of like psychedelic counterculture ideas. but just in a very different way. I've never heard them. I've never heard so much detail about the kind of 19th century conception of what an underground is, because it's like, there's a space to it, and it connects with like music. It connects with like, I mean, to me, I wrote about coffee houses, which were not really underground, but they were kind of places that were meant to be adjacent to or experience a different experience of time. I love that. I'd never really thought about it that way.
Yeah, and I think that there's also almost like a similar dream of that maybe also is animating the coffee house, that like even the place that you know best could be a kind of like could actually hold some other place within it. And the person in the book who I think takes that to the most kind of like grandiose extremes is Pascal Beverly Randolph, who
I'm so glad you brought him up. Yeah, he's like this such a fascinating character. Never heard of this guy. Say his name again. I'm sorry.
Pascal Beverly Randolph.
Yes.
So he is a occultist and sex magician, and also a teacher for the Freedmen's Bureau.
Wow. What a resume.
It's quite amazing. He worked in the mostly in the 1860s through the 1870s. And he has this image of the underground as like a kind of door into like outer space, basically. And so this version of the underground as like a different space, a different time, assumes like the most kind of fantastic dimensions with Randolph.
Yeah, cosmic terms. I mean, again, it's like the White Rabbit, the Alice in Wonderland stuff that's in the 60s. And I mean, Alice in Wonderland comes from an earlier period, but it was picked up by the psychedelic counterculture in part as this metaphor, right, of like a doorway into another dimension. And God, to think of it as this as a kind of occultist who's also working for the Freedmen's Bureau. Yeah. It seems like it kind of this guy connects a lot of what it seems like you're talking about in this book.
Yeah, and to the extent that anyone talks about Pascal Beverly Randolph, and some do, and so I should say that there is still a kind of strand, from what I understand, a kind of strand of spiritual belief that really does kind of claim him as as a major figure. But then as far as kind of academic studies of him go, I think that you get people in the history of kind of esoteric religions who are interested in him, and then to some extent, people in who talk about Black Reconstruction who are interested in him, but that creates a kind of divide between his political work and his occult thinking. And I'm pretty convinced that these two were actually like very deeply intertwined with one another.
Interesting.
And that's the part that I'm like, most struck by in his work. Is like, what are the politics of the occult?
Yeah. Does he make reference to this? I mean, how does he talk about race? And I'm just curious, what are those connections?
Yeah. So, okay. So one of the things I should say that makes it really hard and also compelling to write about the underground is that like usually people aren't talking about it directly, like when it seems kind of most salient, right? And so
in my literature too, like the anti-war activists are not usually, with the exception of like those documentaries, they're not usually saying like we're on the underground and this is what it's like. It's much more, I don't know, this is what an interpretive historian is doing, I think.
Yeah, and part of it, right, is that like sometimes people are saying dangerous stuff. And then part of it in the 19th century case is that it is so inchoate. And the term I use in the book, which I borrow from Raymond Williams, is it's pre-emergent. And, obviously pre-emergent is an appealing term for me because it has its own kind of image of the underground. But, Williams' point when he uses this term as a kind of an auxiliary to the set of terms dominant, residual, emergent that he that he theorizes in his book Marxism and Literature, is that like once an idea becomes emergent, it becomes subject to kind of appropriation and kind of incorporation. But it's at the moment when it's pre-emergent, when like it seems kind of most like most alive, maybe.
That was the word that was popping into my head, was alive.
Oh, really? Okay, good, because
Yeah,
I was really
yeah,
struggling.
yeah. It seems like that makes sense to me. Is that and I mean, I took a I think I taught a class called Los Angeles Underground, which is funny to me because I'd love to go back to it now and like have your book be a part of our sort of framework of what we were thinking about, because now I'm not going to be able to hear the word underground without thinking about the 19th century and sort of where these things come from. But one of the things that we saw in all these kind of like stories about underground cultures in Los Angeles, whether it be hip hop music or skateboarding or surfing and things like that, was that like it was, and it's part of the nostalgia trap, I think, too, is that it was pure and real and alive when when no one had found this yet, and it was just us in the backyard doing our punk experimentations. But then the mainstream world found it, and it got washed out and it got defined, and all the adventure and openness and aliveness was taken from it. That seems like a pretty typical story when talking at least about like subcultures, and it seems like it resonates a little bit with the sort of pre-emergent idea you're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I'm subject to a lot of that as well. But sorry. So the reason that I went down that whole rabbit hole about the pre-emergent was that you had asked about how Randolph talked about race.
Right.
And so often he was very kind of contradictory about his own racial identity. He was sometimes he identified as Black, sometimes he was like had expressed really pretty vicious anti-Black views. But towards the end of his life, he kind of more consistently began to identify as Black, and that was when he started working for the Freedmen's Bureau. But his writing about race is kind of like all over the map and often comes out in ways that were just like are very peculiar and actually even disruptive in his book. Like he'll be talking about other worlds, and then he'll suddenly start talking about anti-Black racism like on this earth.
Right.
There's a particular book that he writes while he's working for the Freedmen's Bureau, and it will be kind of guides for like how to train oneself to be clairvoyant. And then he'll just break his train of thought and say, like, I'm writing these lines in St. Martinville, Louisiana, I can't actually remember the date. 1871 or something.
Sure. Yeah.
And so they're just very kind of unexpected ways in which you can kind of trace the thinking, his thinking around these two things. There's also a particular phrase that he uses, "We may be happy yet," that like just comes up in his writing about the occult, but then he reuses at a meeting, and I'm sorry, I'm actually blanking on which of these meetings it was, but on
that phrase, "We may be happy yet," is that the phrase? I love that.
So it kind of crosses over between his his occult writing and his political activities. He has this image. Sorry.
It's just reminding me of like, again, like 20th century, but like Afrofuturism and like Sun Ra and the kind of like vision of a kind of I don't know, a funky sci-fi future in which racism doesn't function in the way it functions here. Like that doorway is into like this, and that I mean, it's hard not to hear that in Randolph's writing. Jeez.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think the Sun Ra comparison is definitely like apt.
Mm.
And then on some level, I think I partly I think I do kind of like resist it because I I do want to preserve the weirdness of his own thinking in a kind of untranslatable way.
Yeah, I get
So I
that.
kind of go back and forth on that.
Right. Like it's not all just one linear kind of progression here. That like Randolph is occupying his own sort of space too. And that's kind of the
Yeah,
point.
and ultimately his is like a much more pessimistic view, I think.
Mm.
And in his later work, um, some of the work that he writes during Reconstruction, this takes like a really kind of his vision of the future takes a very apocalyptic tone. And interestingly, in that apocalypse, part of what characterizes that apocalypse is that the underground really does emerge in like a kind of biblical way, like the earth kind of turns inside out. And but even that is in a way kind of like better than his he then rewrites that book, and there he's just like he loses the apocalyptic part, he just cuts that out, and he's like, well, in the future, like Black people will be granted some land in the Southwest, and they'll just go there and they'll just like have a really kind of highly developed spiritual life.
Mm.
But like that spiritual, but they'll remain separate.
Interesting.
And then he kills himself. Like he kind of like has a very difficult time imagining like what a future for him would look like in this country.
There's something, yeah, there's you can trace the lineage there all the way to Sun Ra, I think, but yeah, there's some singular tragedy, it seems like, to Randolph's life and in his inability to, I mean, and it's not his inability, it's the world, it's like the door. There's something tragic about that door, in other words. And I wonder if we could connect it a little bit to, if I'm putting on like my left wing cap and saying, wait a second, these doors outside of things and these undergrounds, I mean, isn't it all about capitalism? Isn't it all like imagining some other world is all about kind of escaping capitalism? Because it seems like you eventually get there in your book when you talk about anarchists in Chicago, and I thought that was the place that connected most directly to the stuff that I think about in the 20th century is, you know, left wing politics and that underground. But how much is capitalism connected to all of this underground conception?
Yeah, I mean, very much so, definitely. And definitely this, I mean, the city mysteries are those sensationalist novels I was talking about earlier. You know, their critique is a critique of capitalism. And so
is the city
really
the stand-in for capitalism in those stories?
I think the visible city kind of belongs to the bourgeoisie. And then it's the kind of invisible city where, you know, it's like you know, it's like Marx's hidden abode of production. It's like the place where you can really see what's going on, where you can really see what the bourgeoisie are up to, and you can really see like what everyone else like has been, what they've been reduced to. So yeah, I mean, definitely the critique of capitalism in the city mysteries is like, and the relationship of the underground to that critique is pretty clear. But you know, but yes, it really kind of moves into center stage with the chapter on the Chicago anarchists, because they're the group that I think is most of all of the kinds of undergrounds that I talk about in the book. The Chicago anarchists are the ones who kind of are most easily recognizable to us as an underground.
Right.
And so over the course of the book, um, the it becomes kind of easier the for people to identify themselves as being part of an underground.
Like
As that idea kind of like gains a certain type of clarity. But I also do argue that as it gains clarity, it loses some of the other things that made it so weird and compelling. Maybe this is the nostalgia trap, right?
No, I think you're right. I mean, I'm kind of like as it becomes more and more defined, I mean, obviously by defining it, you're eliminating too, right? Like you're foreclosing on possibilities and ideas that were there before and that aren't. And it seems like I mean, I'm thinking about sexuality in here as well. And it's sort of like, I don't know, the work that's been done on the 19th and 20th centuries in terms of how gay people found themselves in undergrounds too, right? And how that's navigated. And it seems like it connects to the political part of it. It connects to the sort of figurative underground too. But there's also, so much of gay culture and the direction of gay rights in America. There's always been this kind of like this critique from a radical queer underground that's like sort of saying our world is being foreclosed upon by the growing acceptance of a very narrow vision of what being gay is, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually in the conclusion to that chapter on the anarchists, I turned to Herman Melville's unfinished novella, Billy Budd, which is kind of famous as like a canonical queer text. And I end up arguing that it is also, and I'm not the first person to argue this, but that it is a kind of rewriting of the Haymarket trial. And that let me just try to kind of like piece my own way through this argument. But that the kind of version of revolution that it glimpses and then forecloses is also like is also the kind of image that is glimpsed and foreclosed of queerness and of a kind of like queer collectivity in that novel. Sorry, that's not a very good rendition of
no, I think I know what you're saying. I'd never connected those things, the Haymarket and Billy Budd before. But the Melville thing makes a lot of sense because it seems like you doesn't he describe himself as a grub worm at some point, or the narrator of Moby Dick is the grub worm. But either way, I associate Melville too with kind of, the best artists and writers, I guess, are often ones that can kind of render that underground and kind of give us something that we don't. It's almost like the psychonaut, the explorer, the person who finds the thing that isn't visible to the rest of us. And whether they bring it back and how it's received by the above ground world is different every time, I suppose. But like, I don't know, it seems like a pretty common image of our artists is the spelunker, the kind of person that's like going underground to find the treasure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. On the anarchist part of it, the Chicago underground, I mean, how much is the left a kind of conceived of as an underground in America? Because it seems like that's so much of the primary sources that I looked at for thinking about the Vietnam War anti-war movement were quote unquote underground newspapers, and that's how they're listed in the archives. This is like the underground newspaper collection. And I'm like, well, what makes these newspapers underground? I mean, in part it was they were making them kind of on their own with their own mimeograph machines, and it was independent, and there wasn't like a kind of corporate structure to what they were doing. But it also seems like underground denoted something radical about their politics, right? It seemed like that was the underground part of it too. And I'm just wondering in the Chicago anarchist world, how conscious is that connection? And how much are they thinking about like that legacy of underground being political? I'm thinking about
Yeah.
abolition being the obvious. I mean, it's only 30 years after, like 30 years after the Civil War that Haymarket happens, right? Or even less.
Yeah, less.
Yeah.
And many of the many of the anarchists like were kind of radicalized by the abolitionist movement,
Right.
or have experiences in it. And most of that chapter is based on research in the Alarm, which was the English language newspaper that that was published in Chicago by the IWPA, the International Working People's Association. And so one of the things that I was stunned to find when I started reading the issues of the Alarm is that they actually talk about abolitionism a lot. And I started to detect a kind of melancholy around it, like that there was something in the abolitionist movement that was unfinished to them, and so they had a kind of correct diagnosis of that, but also that was inaccessible to them. And so they were subject to a kind of nostalgia trap too, maybe. And
sometimes the nostalgia is real, though. Like they really are long. There's something real tragedy there of like the idea of like longing for something that was alive at a certain time and not yet not being able to kind of conceive or connect to it.
Yeah, and possible. Like, so they have their own kind of version of the underground. And the kind of two signal examples of that are the chapter is actually named after this phrase "subterranean fire" that comes up in the Haymarket trial, and it's in the speech that August Spies gives kind of in his defense, where he says there's a subterranean fire, you cannot put it out, and he's addressing the courtroom here. So he kind of turns to the subterranean imagery, and then I'm also interested in this, particularly interested in this line in the what's called the Pittsburgh Proclamation, which is this manifesto from the IWPA, where they talk about how the work of revolutionary conspiracy proceeds in like parallel lines. And
yeah,
I'm not quite quoting it correctly, but they have an idea of, okay, there's like the visible work of it, and then there's this work that has to go on beneath that visible work of like organizing in parades and like outdoor meetings and so on. So they have their own version of the underground, right? But the thing that seems to me tragic, as you say, and moving about it is that they also seem to be reaching back towards often these undergrounds that like no longer exist. And that they wish, were somehow could be reanimated. And in fact, that language of like what it would be like to reanimate the dead also comes up a lot. Like it's a really, really morbid kind of idiom in the Alarm at this time. And, it's hard to like not read that in the shadow of Haymarket and think about them looking toward their own death. But I think there was also a sense of like, what would it mean to bring back the dead or to re-inhabit the world, like the world that the dead knew, or the world of the dead in some way.
There's such a romance there too. I mean, I use the term nostalgia trap, and I know that's the name of the podcast, but part of that was because I interviewed so many figures from the 1960s in the 2000s and 2010s who spoke of exactly what you're talking about. This kind of like there was this, they really desperately wanted to communicate to me, a younger person who wasn't there, that there was some special thing that you'll never understand, this feeling, right? As much as they can talk about, specific anti-war demonstrations they went to and the content of what they did, there's also this kind of like romanticization, and I always attribute it. I often attribute it to, oh, that's the nostalgia trap. That's just you thinking you were young and everything was alive with possibility. But there's also, I don't know. There's something else going on there, beyond just the nostalgia part of it. It seems like there's a longing for. I like how you put it, a kind of moment where there were more more possibilities or a kind of different set of behaviors and ideas that aren't present anymore. And that's what you're longing for too. Wow.
Yeah, totally.
That's heavy stuff. I love it. And I think your work is so great. Maybe we can do, if we try to do, I don't want to put you on the spot. Let's try to do like an NPR summary of why is this important? Why is the underground, like, why did you write this book? Why is the idea of the underground from the 19th century such an important idea for us to recover now? And again, I don't want to put you on the spot. You can answer that however you want. But I just think your book is so compelling and important.
Oh, thank you. That means a great deal. I do think part of it comes back to the prevalence of resistance as the kind of preferred kind of concept of, especially of a left-wing politics, that like what we need to do is resist, and like what we need to find, even as, in looking toward the past, are like examples of resistance. I do think that this weirder and more expansive and more kind of chaotic version of the underground provides like some kind of alternative to this pressure for resistance that feels like kind of urgent today. And I don't mean that. I don't mean to suggest that like we need to abandon resistance or anything, but I think that it takes for granted the kinds of respective positions of like the resistors and what it is we're resisting in ways that aren't always going to be like true, and that may not be doing us any kind of favors. And so thinking about other models for that kind, like for some kind of unruliness, does feel very important right now. And like trying to find a kind of space to breathe and just like kind of sense of possibility at a time when I do think that like there is a sense that, more than ever, this world is kind of closing in on us.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, and it's this idea of kind of finding a way to build a different world, and what that world looks like beyond just resisting the bad guys. What is it that we want, and that kind of like question of what is on the other side of that door to outer space is such an important one, and you've got some just incredible stories from the 19th century about how people conceived of that. So thank you, Lara Cohen. I want to say the name of your book before we go again. It is called Going Underground: Race, Space, and the Subterranean in the 19th Century United States. I can't recommend it enough. Thanks so much for speaking with me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. This is really fun.
Well, all right. I think that's going to do it for this week's Nostalgia Trap. I want to thank my guest, Lara Cohen. Go check out this book, Going Underground: Race, Space, and the Subterranean in the 19th Century United States. Again, it kind of blew my mind, and I won't be able to think about the underground without everything that Lara has laid out here. So go check out this book. Go check out all our Nostalgia Trap Patreon stuff for our subscribers. The link is in the episode description. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.